The sun was already high when the gates of the air show opened, and people from all over the city began pouring into the wide-open field. Families carried folding chairs, kids held snacks and toy planes, and groups of friends walked in with excited chatter. The air buzzed with the sound of music playing through loudspeakers, mixed with the distant hum of aircraft warming up on the runway. Everyone seemed in a cheerful mood, ready for a long day of watching jets roar across the sky in the middle of this big moving crowd. An old woman slowly walked in through the main entrance. Her steps were careful and measured, as if she was trying not to disturb the memories floating in her mind. She wore a light blue dress that had probably been ironed early that morning, along with a sun hat that had faded slightly with age. Her shoes were simple and soft, and she carried a small handbag that looked like it had been used for many years. She did not look like the kind of person who would normally attend an air show. But there was something steady and determined about the way she held herself. People around her noticed her, but not in a kind way. A group of teenagers glanced at her and giggled quietly, nudging each other as if her appearance was a joke. A couple standing a few steps behind her exchanged looks and whispered something about how she was probably lost or confused. A man carrying a huge camera walked around her impatiently, as though she was blocking his perfect shot. But none of their comments seemed to bother her. She just kept walking forward one step at a time, her eyes scanning the sky above as if she was waiting for something specific. Many spectators rushed past her to find seats near the front. Some wanted shade, others wanted the closest view of the runway. But the old woman didn't seem interested in the seats. Instead, she walked toward a thin red rope that marked the restricted viewing area. She stopped just a short distance from it and rested one hand on the handle of her bag. The other hand held a small silver pin, barely noticeable unless someone looked closely. She kept rubbing her thumb across it gently, the way a person touches something precious. The morning announcement started, and a cheerful voice welcomed everyone to the annual air show. The crowd clapped, kids screamed with excitement, and cameras clicked as the first plane rose into the sky. The show had officially begun. People were cheering, pointing, and filming, but the old woman stayed quiet. She simply watched the sky with a soft look in her eyes, a look that had more depth than excitement. It was a look that came from memory, not entertainment. After the first demonstration, where people began noticing how close she stood to the rope, some seemed annoyed, thinking she was standing in a spot they wanted. A young man with sunglasses tapped her shoulder lightly and told her she might want to move back because this area gets loud. She smiled politely and thanked him, but she didn't step away. Another woman walked past her and muttered that she should let younger people stand in the front, since they could appreciate the show better. A couple of kids snickered when her hat nearly flew off from a gust of wind, and one of them whispered something about Grandma wanting attention. Still, she said nothing. She adjusted her hat carefully and continued looking toward the runway. Her silence wasn't the silence of someone who was scared or offended. It was the silence of someone who knew exactly why she was there, even if the rest of the world had no idea. A volunteer wearing a bright vest approached her with a friendly smile. He slowed down as he came close, probably noticing that she was older than most of the spectators and might need help. He greeted her kindly and asked if she needed a chair or some water. She thanked him for his kindness and assured him she was fine. He hesitated for a second, then asked gently if she had come alone. Again, she nodded and said she had. The volunteer looked at the silver pin in her hand and seemed curious. He asked if it was a souvenir. She smiled quietly and said it belonged to an old friend. He didn't want to pry, so he wished her a pleasant time and walked away. She watched him go, then looked back at the sky with the same soft, distant expression. The next demonstration was louder and more dramatic. For jets flew in tight formation, drawing shapes in the sky with their long white trails. People around her were cheering and clapping their hands. Children pointed at the planes and shouted excitedly. The old woman watched, but she didn't cheer. Her eyes followed every curve and turn of the jets, but she remained still, as if watching something personal, something that no one else could see. A man standing nearby noticed how focused she was. He joked to his friend that the old woman probably thought she could fly one of these jets herself. His friend laughed loudly, and they both made a few more comments. She heard them, but her face didn't change. She simply closed her fingers around the pin for a moment, holding it tightly before relaxing again. As the Jets completed their final maneuver, the announcer began describing the next performance. This one involved a demonstration team led by a pilot known for his sharp skills and precise timing. The crowd seemed to recognize the name because they cheered even louder. The old woman's expression changed slightly. Her eyes softened even more, and her posture straightened just a little. It was the first sign of emotion she had shown since entering the field. The sound of engines grew louder as the next set of jets prepared for takeoff. The ground vibrated beneath everyone's feet. The old woman stepped a little closer to the rope, not crossing it, but leaning forward just enough to get a clearer view of the aircraft. A man behind her sighed loudly, annoyed that she had moved in front of him. He whispered something to his friend, but this time the old woman didn't hear. Her attention was locked on the runway. The jets came into view, shimmering slightly in the heat. You could see the pilots inside, helmets on, hands steady. The announcer kept talking, explaining the formation pattern and the skill level required. People raised their phones again, preparing to record. But the old woman wasn't recording anything. She wasn't holding anything except that small silver pin. As the jets rolled forward, she lifted her hand slightly, almost like someone greeting an old memory. The gesture was small, almost invisible to the crowd. But the meaning behind it was heavy and full. The roar of the engines grew so loud that no one could hear their own thoughts. The jets took off with incredible power, climbing upward in a steep angle. The crowd exploded with cheers. Kids screamed with joy. People clapped. Phones shook as they tried to film the takeoff. But behind all that noise, the old woman simply watched, her eyes following the lead jet with a look of recognition. The kind people have when they see something they once loved. She remembered being at this same airfield many years ago. She remembered the sound of tools clattering on metal, the smell of fuel in the air, the excitement of young pilots learning to trust their aircraft. She remembered standing near the runway when her husband worked long nights as a mechanic, sometimes coming home with oil stains on his sleeves and stories she didn't fully understand, but always loved hearing. She remembered how proud he was of every plane that took off safely, of every pilot who made it through another day, and now she was here again, older, alone, standing quietly among strangers who saw her as nothing more than an old lady who wandered too close to the front row. But to her, the airfield was not just a place. It was a chapter of her life. It was where she had waited for her husband after long shifts. It was where she had once stood and waved at aircraft, because he told her he could sometimes see her from the cockpit during tests. It was where they had shared so many moments that no one in the crowd would ever understand. The jets performed a sharp turn overhead. The old woman felt something warm in her eyes. She blinked slowly, holding back tears that had nothing to do with sadness. They were tears of memory, of connection, of something deep that stayed alive even after time had passed. She raised the pin again, just a little, and whispered something so quiet that only she could hear. People continued mocking her now and then, thinking she was strange or out of place. But the truth was, she was the only person in that crowd who wasn't a stranger to the air. She understood more about this place than most of them ever would. And even though no one else knew her story, she carried it with her in a way that didn't need to be explained. As the jets thundered across the sky in tight formation, the old woman stood firm. She didn't move back. She didn't flinch. She simply watched as though the sky itself was speaking to her. The roar of the engines washed over her like an old song she remembered from years ago, a song that reminded her of someone she once waited for every evening. And while the crowd cheered and celebrated the skill of the pilots, the old woman felt something else, something calmer, deeper, and more meaningful. She felt connected. She felt seen, not by the people around her, but by the sky above. And that alone was enough to keep her standing there. No matter what anyone said, she held the silver pin to her chest and whispered, "I made it back." And the show had only just begun. The heat of the afternoon settled over the airfield as more people filled the open area. The smell of popcorn, sunscreen, and jet fuel mixed together in the warm breeze. The announcer kept the crowd engaged with jokes, history, and updates about the upcoming demonstrations. Everyone seemed excited about the next performance. especially because it involved one of the most famous pilot teams in the region. The old woman still stood near the rope, holding her place with quiet patience. Her posture was calm and her eyes stayed focused on the sky. She barely moved except to shift her weight or adjust her hat when the wind caught it. The silver pin remained in her hand, and she touched it with the same gentle care she had shown since the morning. As the crowd continued to grow, the space around her became tighter. People brushed against her without apologizing, and some even stepped in front of her as if she wasn't there. A young father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders, unintentionally blocking her view. He didn't look back at her, too busy pointing to the runway and telling his daughter about the jets. The old woman stepped slightly to the side, giving herself a clearer angle, but the movement caught the attention of a pair of teenagers nearby. One of them raised an eyebrow and whispered something to the other, and both of them laughed. They seemed amused by how determined she looked. One of them even said she probably didn't know what she was watching, but she never turned to look at them. She didn't react to their laughter. She stayed focused, as if their voices didn't exist. A woman with a bright scarf approached and stood next to her for a moment, watching the runway. After a few seconds, she glanced at the old woman and offered a small smile. "It's crowded today, isn't it?" she said kindly. The old woman returned a gentle smile and nodded. "Are you here for someone in particular?" the woman asked, curious. The old woman took a breath before answering. "I'm here for something important," she said softly. Her voice wasn't shaky, but it held a weight that made the woman pause. Before the woman could ask more, her husband called her from behind, waving for her to join their group. She apologized politely and stepped away, leaving the old woman alone again. The brief conversation didn't change much, but it was one of the few moments that day when someone addressed her. Without mocking her or assuming she was confused, a little boy wandered close to the rope, pointing at the jets warming up in the distance. He didn't seem to notice the old woman until he nearly bumped into her. When he did, he stepped back quickly and looked up at her. She smiled at him, and for a moment, his eyes softened. He looked at the silver pin in her hand, curiosity bright on his face. "Is that a medal?" he asked. "It belonged to someone very dear to me," she replied quietly. Before the boy could ask more, his mother rushed over, pulling him away gently, telling him not to bother strangers. The boy waved a little as he walked off, but his mother didn't look back. The old woman watched them leave and turned her eyes to the runway again. The announcer's voice grew louder, signaling that a new performance would begin soon. People straightened up, held their phones higher, and pushed forward slightly. A few shoulders bumped her again, but she didn't step back. Her eyes had a calm firmness now, like she was preparing herself for something she had waited for. A man with a red hat suddenly tapped her arm, not gently, but not harshly either, more like someone who isn't thinking about how their actions might feel. He told her she needed to step back because she was too close to the rope. She looked at him politely and said she wasn't crossing it, but he insisted she was making people uncomfortable. The irony went unnoticed by him. She stepped half an inch back, even though she knew she wasn't doing anything wrong. She didn't want trouble, and she didn't want to argue. She simply wanted to stand there, to see what she came for, and to hold her memories in peace. Shortly after, another announcement echoed through the loudspeakers. The famous demonstration pilot team was getting ready. Their jets rolled out one by one, gleaming in the sunlight. The engines hummed louder, and a wave of anticipation rippled through the spectators. Even people who had been joking or complaining a moment earlier suddenly became focused, their attention glued to the aircraft. The old woman's breath steadied. Her eyes followed every movement on the runway. The jets lined up neatly, and ground crew members signaled them through their final checks. The sun reflected off the metal surfaces, creating bright flashes of light that danced across the airfield as the jets prepared to take off. The old woman held the pin closer. She didn't realize she was doing it. It happened naturally, like her hand knew what her heart needed. The warmth of the pin felt comforting. She closed her eyes just long enough to inhale deeply, then opened them again as the jets began to accelerate. The sudden roar shook the ground. People gasped, cheered, shouted, or covered their ears. Children squealed with excitement. The old woman didn't gasp or shout. She stood steady, letting the vibrations pass through her like a wave she had ridden many times before in her youth. She watched the lead jet, its tail lifting, wheels rising from the ground. That moment when a jet first leaves the earth had always held something sacred for her. She had seen it hundreds of times when she was younger. Each time, she felt the same mixture of fear and pride as she watched her husband working on the runway. Checking aircraft, helping pilots prepare for missions, doing everything in his power to ensure they returned safely. As the jets climbed higher, the crowd roared with admiration. Phones were everywhere, people shouting, "Look," and "Wow," while trying to capture the perfect video. But the old woman didn't need a video. Her eyes followed the lead jet, like someone following a familiar face in a crowd. Her gaze was soft but focused. It was more than admiration, it was connection. The jets turned sharply, forming a tight shape against the sky. The announcer described their skill, their training, their discipline. But the old woman barely heard him. Her attention was fixed on the lead jet. Something about its movements reminded her of the stories her husband used to bring home the pilots he worked with. The mistakes they learned from, the victories they celebrated, the camaraderie they built. A memory drifted into her mind. She remembered standing near this same runway many decades ago, holding a small bag of food she had brought for her husband during a long overnight shift. She had waited quietly near the fence until he noticed her. He walked over with a tired smile, thanking her for always showing up, even when he didn't ask. She remembered how proud he looked when he talked about helping young pilots learn the ropes. He loved the sound of the planes, the smell of jet fuel, the thrill of watching aircraft lift into the sky. The memory warmed her heart but also stung a little. She missed him deeply. Coming here was her way of honoring him, even if no one else knew why she stood there so quietly with a silver pin in her hand. The jets swooped low, passing over the crowd. Wind rushed across the field with incredible force, knocking hats off heads, sending papers flying and startling children. People laughed or shouted with surprise. The old woman reached for her hat, but didn't panic. She steadied it with her fingertips and kept watching the sky. A group of people behind her started complaining again, irritated that she hadn't moved from her spot. One of them muttered that she was blocking their recording. Another said she must be too stubborn to listen. Their voices felt like faint scratches against the surface of her focus. She heard them, but she didn't allow their words to settle inside her mind. She had spent a lifetime learning what mattered and what didn't. The jets climbed again, soaring high until they were nearly tiny dots. The old woman lifted her hand slightly, the silver pin glinting in the sun. She wasn't waving. She was remembering. She was recalling all the times she and her husband had watched planes together. All the times he had told her which jet was which. All the nights he had come home exhausted but fulfilled as she lowered her hand. A gust of wind pushed unexpectedly against her back. She stumbled slightly, and for the first time, someone reached out to help her. It was a middle-aged man with kind eyes. He steadied her gently and asked if she was okay. She nodded gratefully and thanked him. He gave her a warm smile before returning to his family. It was a small moment, but it reminded her that not everyone around her was unkind. Some people simply didn't understand why she was there, but that didn't make them cruel. It just made them unaware. The jets began their signature maneuver, a synchronized split that made the crowd gasp. People shouted in excitement, and applause broke through the noise of the engines. The old woman watched every second closely, her eyes reflecting the sunlight and the movement of the jets. She whispered something into the air, something soft and full of meaning. It wasn't a prayer or a plea. It was a message to someone she still loved, someone she believed could hear her in the quiet corners of her heart. "I hope you see this," she murmured. The jets passed overhead again, closer this time. The lead jet dipped slightly in a smooth arc, a move that felt strangely familiar, not because she had seen it performed, but because it looked like something her husband had once described during a test flight decades ago. The old woman's breath caught for a moment. She blinked and held the pin tighter, her eyes following the lead jet with deeper intensity than before. The crowd kept cheering, unaware of the quiet emotion unfolding only a few feet away from them. They saw a performance. She saw a memory coming alive. She wasn't just watching jets fly. She was watching her past rise into the sky again. The sound of the jets echoed across the airfield, rolling like thunder that never fully faded. The crowd was buzzing with excitement, pointing their phones at the sky, trying to catch every twist and turn. The old woman, however, wasn't thinking about recording anything. Her attention was fixed completely on the lead jet. Something about the way it moved stirred a feeling inside her that she hadn't felt in years, something familiar, something personal. She took a slow breath and let it out carefully, as if controlling her own emotions was just as important as watching the aircraft. Her fingers curled around the silver pin she held, the one she had kept close ever since she arrived. Its metal surface felt warm from her touch, but also from the afternoon sun. She rubbed her thumb across it gently, the way people touch something meaningful when they're lost in thought. Above her, the jets shifted into a diamond formation, gliding across the sky in near-perfect alignment. The announcer explained the move, calling it one of the most difficult patterns in the team's routine. The crowd cheered, amazed by the precision. But the old woman didn't look amazed. She looked thoughtful, almost emotional. Watching the lead jet with the same quiet intensity she had shown earlier, she remembered a long time ago, when her husband used to describe formations like these. He would come home late at night, tired from hours of work, and sit with her while drinking warm tea. He told her about the pilots he worked with, about their training, their habits, their strengths. He always spoke with admiration for their skill and discipline. But he also said something she never forgot. You can tell a lot about a pilot by how they handle the sky. She didn't know much about flying herself, but she knew him. And she knew that, when he said something like that, he meant it deeply. Now, as she watched the lead jet make another careful turn, she found herself wondering what her husband would say if he were here. She wondered if he would recognize anything familiar in the pilot's movements, some old technique, some signature touch, something passed down from the instructors he once worked with. The jets continued their performance, slicing through the air with incredible grace. The old woman shifted her weight slightly, trying to get a better look. Her feet ached, but she didn't let that stop her. She had been standing for hours, yet she felt as steady as the rope in front of her. The excitement around her grew louder, but her own thoughts were quieter, more focused. A teenager next to her suddenly shouted to his friend, pointing at the jets. "Look at that one. The front pilot's doing something different?" he exclaimed. His friend shrugged, more interested in filming than watching with his own eyes. "Probably part of the show," he said, but the old woman noticed it too. The lead jet dipped lower than the others, not enough to alarm anyone, but enough to make her heart skip a beat. She wasn't sure why it struck her so strongly. Maybe it was an old memory rising up again. Maybe it was the way her husband once described a similar move during training flights. Or maybe it was just her imagination. But the moment felt significant. The jets climbed again and spread apart, leaving trails of white in the sky. The crowd gasped as the formation broke, each jet peeling off in a different direction. The announcer's voice rose with excitement, explaining that this was one of the signature maneuvers of the team. People clapped, some even whistled, and the atmosphere grew more electric with every passing second. The old woman watched the lead jet alone now, separated from the rest. She followed it with her eyes, tracing its movement like someone trying to understand a language spoken without words. The jet turned in a wide loop, then passed directly above the crowd. Wind rushed down, causing hats to fly and shirts to ripple. The woman reached up to steady her hat, then lowered her hand again when the wind settled. She noticed something else, something that made her heart stir again. When the lead jet passed overhead, she saw the glint of sunlight on its wings. It reminded her of how her husband used to talk about the shine, as he called it. He said that certain aircraft caught the sun in a particular way, depending on how the pilot handled them. He used to walk her to the runway sometimes, showing her the different angles and explaining how each move reflected a pilot's style. She remembered him lifting her hand once, placing it against the cool metal of a jet and saying softly, "Everything leaves a mark, even the way someone flies." The memory washed over her gently, like a soft breeze. She closed her eyes for just a moment, then opened them again as the jets regrouped. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to see, but the lead jet returning to formation made her straighten her back. She watched as the pilots moved into their next maneuver, their skills blending into one seamless performance. Nearby, a man with a camera stood on his tiptoes, trying to get a better angle. He knocked into the old woman slightly, not out of rudeness, but out of distraction. He apologized quickly and stepped aside. She nodded, accepting the apology without any resentment. She understood that people were excited, and excitement often made them forget the small things. A family standing behind her discussed the performance loudly. The father said the lead pilot was rumored to be one of the most disciplined pilots in the country. The mother said she had read that he trained under a mentor who had been known for his old-school techniques. The old woman's ears perked up. Old-school techniques. That phrase wasn't common anymore. She knew what that meant: training methods from decades ago. The kind her husband had been part of. Her heart beat a little faster. Not from excitement, but from recognition. She looked up at the lead jet again, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied its movement. She wasn't imagining it. There was something familiar about the way the pilot flew. It wasn't just precision. It was something softer, something human. A small difference in the turns, the timing, the angles. She didn't know the technical words for it, but her heart recognized the pattern, the same way a person recognizes a voice in a crowd. The jets looped around again, and the lead pilot performed a maneuver that wasn't mentioned by the announcer. It wasn't flashy or showy. It was simple, almost subtle. But it was something she had seen before, something her husband once called the quiet greeting. Small dip of the wing, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. Not part of any show routine, not a trick, not a performance move. The old woman's breath caught in her throat. She knew where she had seen it. She knew exactly who had taught it. Her husband. He had learned it from a senior pilot when he was young, and he later passed it on to others. He described it as a respectful gesture between pilots, a way of acknowledging something or someone without breaking protocol. It was rarely used anymore. It belonged to an older generation, and now here it was again. It's performed by a pilot who soared across the sky like he carried memories from decades. Go. She felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes. She lifted a hand slightly, almost instinctively, as if responding to the gesture. Her fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from emotion. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't confused. She knew exactly what she had seen. Nearby, the crowd continued cheering. People were excited about the big tricks, the loud passes, the sharp turns. No one else noticed the quiet dip of the lead jet. But she noticed. She recognized the meaning behind it. And for the first time that day, she felt something warm settle in her chest, a sense of connection that reached across time. The jets lined up for another maneuver. This one involved a steep dive followed by a sharp pull upward. The crowd braced themselves, expecting a dramatic move. The old woman, however, wasn't focused on the drama. She was watching the lead pilot closely, waiting to see if he would do something else that reminded her of the past. As the jets began the dive, she held her breath. The roar shook the ground again, and people shouted in excitement. But her eyes never left the lead jet. She watched as it pulled up sharply, trailing the others perfectly. Then, just as they leveled out, the lead jet dipped one wing again, this time slightly more visible. Her hand tightened around the silver pin. She blinked hard, trying to steady herself. She whispered something under her breath, so quiet that no one standing near her could hear. "I know that move," she said softly. Her mind drifted to a memory standing beside her husband as he talked with a young pilot who had just completed training. He had told the pilot that the quiet dip was a way to show respect to someone who had guided you or taught you something important. It wasn't part of the official manual. It was a tradition passed down quietly, a sign of gratitude. The old woman had heard him teach it several times over the years, and she had always found it beautiful, simple, meaningful, full of heart. It made her proud to know he was part of something so thoughtful in a world that often seemed loud and rushed. Now, standing near the rope with strangers around her, she felt like a part of that old tradition had reached out through the sky to touch her again. A couple standing beside her finally noticed her expression. The woman asked if she was okay, seeing the tears in her eyes. The old woman nodded quickly. She didn't want to draw attention to herself. She didn't want anyone thinking she was overwhelmed or confused. She was neither. She was remembering, and remembering was a quiet thing, something best kept inside. The Jets continued their performance, each move more impressive than the last. The crowd remained thrilled, but the old woman felt something deeper, something she couldn't put into words. The pilot in the lead jet wasn't flying just for show. She could tell. He was flying with intention, with memory, with something that connected the past to the present. She wondered if he even realized how closely he resembled the style of the pilots her husband once trained. She wondered if he knew the quiet dip of the wing came from a generation that cared deeply about tradition. She wondered if he could possibly know that someone standing quietly at the front of the crowd had once watched the same gesture from the man she loved as the Jets prepared for their final pass. The old woman felt a deep stillness settle over her. The noise around her faded, replaced by the steady beat of her heart. She lifted her hands slightly again, holding the pin close to her chest. She wasn't waving. She was acknowledging something to herself, something only she understood. The Jets roared by one last time, their engines shaking the air. People clapped and shouted. Kids jumped up and down. Phones filmed every second. But the old woman watched the lead jet, waiting, hoping, breathing slowly, and as it passed, the lead pilot dipped the wing one more time. This time, it was unmistakable. The old woman closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness, not tears of loss, but tears of recognition. Someone in the sky remembered something she thought the world had forgotten. The crowd at the air show was already excited from the earlier performances, but when the next group of jets prepared for their formation pass, the energy climbed even higher. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. People held up their phones. Conversations blended together into one large hum of noise. Yet, in the middle of that busy scene, the old woman stood still, her eyes focused on the sky as if she was waiting for something only she could recognize. She held the silver pin tightly in her hand, and anyone watching her closely would have noticed that she was no longer trembling. Instead, she looked steady, like the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. Captain Reed soared in the lead jet high above the crowd. The sunlight bounced off the wings, leaving streaks of brightness that cut across the open sky. From below, his plane looked like a small metal bird, barely visible at times, as it sliced through the distance. But inside the cockpit, everything was clear to him. He could see the ground layout, the crowd shape, the patterns of people moving, and most surprising of all, the old woman near the safety tape. He didn't know her name, or why she was standing exactly the way she was, but something about the way she raised her hand earlier tugged at a memory deep inside him. He kept replaying the gesture in his mind. Even as he went through the required motions of the show, it wasn't the wave of someone greeting a pilot. It was far more precise, slow, intentional, and angled in a way that reminded him of footage from older Air Force training programs preserved in dusty archive rooms. His mentor had once shown him clips of ground crew signaling pilots with hand gestures that modern systems had replaced. Some of those gestures were simple, some complex, but all had meaning. And the one the old woman used wasn't random. It was the kind used by maintenance crew during a very specific moment of aircraft readiness. Captain Reed shook his head inside the helmet, trying to stay focused. But the image of the old woman kept returning, stronger each time. On the ground, the crowd cheered as the formation of jets prepared to sweep past the runway again. The rumble of engines grew louder, and people leaned forward as if trying to get closer, even though they were already packed along the fence. The old woman didn't move. Her eyes followed only one jet, the lead jet. When the planes reached the far end of their route, they rose into a smooth arc. The maneuver was supposed to be tight and clean, each jet sticking to its position with precision. But Captain Reed felt a tug in his chest. Something felt wrong. Not unsafe, just unfinished. The feeling wouldn't leave him, and the moment the jet straightened again, he made a decision he knew would raise questions. He broke formation. It was a small break, Not enough to alarm the crowd or the ground crew, but enough for the other pilots in the air to notice. The gap widened slightly between him and the next jet. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The radio crackled in his ear, the voice of the second pilot calling his name. "Lead, you're off pattern." "I know," Captain Reed replied, steady but distant. He didn't explain yet. He just needed a few seconds to understand what his instincts were pushing him toward. On the ground, people gasped, thinking it was part of the presentation. A few even cheered, believing the deviation was an intentional stunt. But those who understood air shows well noticed that the timing was off. The old woman, however, didn't react with surprise. She simply watched the jet tilt in her direction as if she had expected it. The radio continued to buzz. "Lead. Return to formation. You're drifting too far." Captain Reed finally responded with more clarity. "I need to confirm something. I'll be back on schedule in a moment." He angled the plane slightly lower. Not dangerously low, but lower than what was written in the show guidelines. It was enough to make some of the ground personnel tense. The announcer continued speaking through the speakers, trying to maintain the excitement, but there was a visible shift among the staff. They could tell something unusual was happening. The crowd noticed too. Phones went up higher. Some people pointed. A few murmured, trying to figure out why the lead jet seemed out of step with the rest. Captain Reed didn't break safety rules, but he did bend the demonstration rules just enough to follow his instinct. He dipped the jet's wing gently. It was a slow motion, deliberate and respectful. Many in the crowd clapped, thinking it was a beautiful move. But older veterans in attendance recognized it immediately. A wing dip was a traditional sign of respect, something used long ago. Before so many military traditions were replaced by new protocols, the old woman's eyes filled with tears the moment she saw it. High above, Captain Reed breathed deeply. The wing dip wasn't planned, wasn't rehearsed, and wasn't something he could easily explain to his commanders later. But it felt right. It felt like the only action that matched what his heart was telling him. As the formation moved forward to complete the rest of the show, Captain Reed maintained a slightly separate path. He performed each required maneuver, but always kept an eye on the spot where the old woman stood. When the show finally reached its closing phase, instead of joining the final group exit, he requested early landing clearance through the internal channel. The air boss on the ground hesitated. "This isn't standard procedure, Captain." "I understand," Reed said calmly. "I need to land. You have a technical concern?" the air boss asked, trying to make sense of the request. "Nothing mechanical," Reed answered. "But I need to land." There was silence for a few seconds, heavy and uncertain. Then the air boss gave clearance. "Land on runway 2. Maintain usual safety spacing." Captain Reed brought his jet down smoothly, guiding it across the runway with precision. The crowd didn't fully understand what they were seeing. Some thought something was wrong with the plane. Others assumed the early landing was part of the act, but the old woman didn't move. She stood exactly where she had been the entire time, still clutching the silver pin. The jet slowed, rolling toward the designated area. Ground staff jogged out to ensure the path was clear and guide the plane, though they looked understandably confused. It wasn't often that a demonstration pilot changed protocol like this. The canopy opened, and Captain Reed climbed out, pulling off his helmet. The crowd quieted almost instantly. It wasn't because of an announcement or an instruction. It was because of the way the pilot walked directly, purposefully. With no hint of hesitation, he didn't look around at the spectators or wave for applause. He only looked in one direction, the old woman. People parted slowly as he approached, opening a path without being asked. The same teens who laughed at her earlier now fell silent, unsure what was happening. Families lowered their phones. Even the volunteers stepped back, sensing something meaningful in the moment. The old woman stood waiting, her hands gently closed around the pin. Captain Reed stopped in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them felt paused, as if even the wind had slowed down. Then Captain Reed saluted her. It wasn't a quick or casual salute. It was full, respectful, held firmly, and meant from the heart. The crowd gasped softly. Many people, especially those who had dismissed her earlier, looked confused, embarrassed, or even ashamed. They didn't understand yet, but they could tell something significant had just happened. The old woman blinked, overwhelmed. She slowly lifted her trembling hand, not to return the salute, but to open her palm so he could see the silver pin clearly. Captain Reed recognized it immediately. His eyes softened. He told her quietly, "I thought I saw it from the air." She smiled with emotion she had held in for years. It was his. Captain Reed nodded, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Your husband trained the pilot who trained me." Single tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't speak right away. She just held the pin closer, almost like she was protecting it. People around them listened carefully, but no one dared interrupt. The pilot continued in a gentle voice. "We still talk about him in the old hangar. His work saved lives. His methods are still respected." She inhaled slowly, her shoulders trembling. "Most people don't remember him anymore." "I do," Captain Reed said. "And many others do, even if you don't hear their names." The crowd stood speechless. A few veterans placed their hands over their hearts. Parents whispered explanations to their children, helping them understand that respect sometimes arrives quietly but still deeply. Captain Reed bowed his head slightly. The wing dip was for him. "For both of you." The old woman's eyes filled again, but this time her tears were of gratitude, not sadness. She had come to the air show hoping for a glimpse of the past, not expecting anyone to understand. Yet here stood a young pilot, honoring a man he had never met, but still felt connected to through stories and legacy. The moment stretched quietly between them before the sound of applause began, soft at first, then growing wider and stronger. It wasn't the wild cheering that usually filled the air show. It was slow, respectful, and sincere. People weren't applauding the jet or the performance anymore. They were applauding the old woman. They were applauding her husband. And they were applauding the connection that had bridged across years and generations. The teens who mocked her earlier clapped too, their faces red with guilt. Volunteers wiped their eyes. Even the announcer, who usually spoke loudly and confidently, stood silent. Captain Reed stepped aside, allowing her the space and the moment she deserved. For the first time that day, the old woman didn't feel alone. She didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel like someone who was in the way. She felt seen. She felt respected. And she felt her husband's legacy lift gently back into the world, carried not by noise or crowds, but by one pilot who recognized a simple hand gesture that meant everything. The airfield slowly settled into a calmer rhythm as the last of the demonstration jets disappeared behind the clouds, leaving white trails fading gently across the wide blue sky. The announcer spoke with excitement, congratulating the team on their flawless performance. The crowd clapped loudly, their voices echoing across the metal barriers and open ground. Kids chattered, adults exchanged comments about how impressive the show had been, and people began lowering their phones now that the final maneuver was over. But the old woman didn't clap. She stood completely still, her eyes filled with quiet emotion as she watched the sky where the jets had just flown. She didn't speak, she didn't move, she didn't blink much. She simply breathed slowly and held the small silver pin close to her chest. Her fingers trembled, but her posture stayed steady. She had seen the final wing dip. Not the barely noticeable one earlier, not the subtle acknowledgement during the formation, but the clear, intentional gesture at the end. She knew what it meant. She knew it wasn't part of the routine. She knew it wasn't meant for the crowd. It was meant for someone who remembered, and someone who understood. She swallowed gently, letting the feelings settle deep inside her chest. The memories held within her heart felt as if they had been brought into the sunlight after many decades of staying quiet. The gesture had spoken in a language she knew well, a language her husband used to teach young pilots with pride and precision, a language of respect and remembrance. People began shifting around her, preparing to move toward the food stalls or the parking lots. The airshow wasn't over entirely, but the biggest highlight had passed. Some people were already discussing where to go next. Others checked their videos, replaying the most dramatic maneuvers. A few looked around, searching for shade or water. The field buzzed with movement again. The old woman finally blinked, releasing the tears that had been building up in her eyes. She wiped them gently before they could fall. She didn't want anyone to think she was upset. She wasn't upset at all. She was moved deeply and quietly. She stepped back a little, adjusting her balance. Her legs felt tired after standing for so long, but she didn't mind. She had no intention of leaving yet. Something inside her told her to wait, to stay exactly where she was. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. She wasn't even sure if anything would happen. But she felt a pull inside her chest, soft but strong feeling telling her that her time here wasn't finished. Near the runway, the jets were returning. Their engines hummed softly now, not roaring like before. The sound was gentle, almost comforting, like a whisper of the sky instead of a shout. People noticed the returning aircraft and began clapping again, expecting the pilots to step out and wave from a distance. The old woman watched the lead jet carefully. It moved slower than the others, as though the pilot was making sure every step was precise and intentional. The aircraft rolled past the other parked jets and came to a stop closer to the front of the field, much closer than any aircraft normally parked after a performance. A few people noticed and murmured among themselves as that allowed. Someone asked, "I don't think they usually park there," another said. The announcer paused mid-sentence, his voice trailing off slightly before he regained his rhythm. Unsure how to explain the unexpected choice, the old woman stood frozen. She didn't know why the jet had stopped there, but her heart had begun to beat faster. Her fingers tightened around the silver pin, her breath shallow but steady. Something significant was happening. She could feel it in the way the air shifted, the way the atmosphere grew quiet around her. The cockpit opened slowly. The pilot inside removed his helmet, revealing a calm, steady expression. He climbed out carefully, not rushing, not performing, not waving dramatically. He rested one hand on the side of the jet for a moment, taking a breath as if gathering himself. People started taking pictures, thinking this might be part of the show. Some kind of meet and greet or surprise moment. But the pilot wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking directly at the old woman. She didn't notice at first. She was still watching the aircraft, waiting for the next step. Not expecting anything more than the quiet return she had seen hundreds of times in the past. But when the pilot took a few steps forward straight toward, Hershey felt her stomach tighten. He didn't look at anyone else. He didn't wave to the crowd or respond to the cameras. His eyes were locked onto her, as though he had been waiting to see her. The people standing near her stepped aside slightly, surprised by the direction the pilot was walking. Some whispered, wondering who he was approaching. Others moved back out of respect or curiosity. As the crowd shifted, a small path formed between the pilot and the old woman. She finally looked up. Their eyes met. The air felt still. He walked slowly, respectfully, every movement deliberate. When he reached the rope, he paused, lifted it gently with the back of his glove, and stepped under it. No one stopped him. Not security, not staff, not the announcer. Everyone had fallen into a quiet hush. Watching a moment unfold, without understanding its meaning, he approached her until he stood. Just a few steps away, the old woman felt her breath tremble. He stopped, stood tall, and then in front of thousands of people, he saluted her. The crowd fell silent. Even children stopped moving. The wind seemed to pause. The air between them held a weight, a meaning. A history no one else understood. She stared at him. Too stunned to speak, the pilot held the salute for several long seconds, then lowered his hand slowly and gently. His eyes softened as he looked at her. He didn't speak right away. He waited, offering her the space to breathe, to understand, to steady herself. Finally, in a quiet voice filled with genuine respect, he said, "Ma'am, I recognize the pin you were holding." Her fingers tightened around it instinctively. She looked down at it, then back at him, confused but listening. He continued, his tone gentle. "My mentor used to wear the same one. He talked about the man who taught him everything he knew. Told me about his discipline, his patience, his dedication. He said he learned more from that man than from any book or manual. The old woman felt her heart squeeze. The pilot took a deeper breath. Your husband trained my mentor, he said quietly. And everything I learned, everything I am as a pilot, came from that line of teaching. She felt her knees weaken slightly, but she stood firm. Tears welled in her eyes again, and she blinked them away. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. You knew about him? The pilot nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. He's part of our history. He's part of the tradition we still carry. A lot of us wouldn't be here without the foundation he helped build. The old woman placed a trembling hand over her mouth. Her breath hitched. She tried to speak, but no words came. The emotion was too strong, too overwhelming, too unexpected. The pilot continued softly. We were taught the quiet wing dip as a sign of respect. My mentor told me it came from your husband. He said the man who taught it believed respect should be shown, not spoken. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she didn't wipe it away this time. She let it fall. She didn't want to hide the emotion. This moment was too sacred to pretend she felt anything less. The pilot's voice softened even more. When I saw you holding that pin, ma'am, I knew who you were. I knew you weren't just another spectator. The crowd around them remained silent, watching a moment they couldn't begin to understand. Phones lowered unknowingly. People forgot about recording. A hush settled over the airfield. The old woman finally found her voice. He would have been proud, she whispered. The pilot nodded respectfully. We're the ones who are proud, he replied. Your husband left a mark that still guides us. The old woman inhaled deeply, her chest rising slowly. She felt something release inside her years of quiet grief, quiet longing, quiet memory. She had come here to feel close to him again, never expecting the sky to answer back. She reached out her hand slightly, not to touch the pilot, but to show him the pin more clearly. He leaned forward to look at it, then gave another small, respectful nod. That's the one, he said softly. She smiled, a real, warm, gentle smile that softened her entire face. It wasn't the smile of someone happy simply because of a nice gesture. It was the smile of someone who had carried a heavy memory for a long time and now felt it lighten. The pilot took a small step back, giving her space. Thank you for being here, he said quietly. She held the pin close to her chest again. Thank you for remembering, she replied, her voice steady. He gave her one final, respectful nod before stepping back. He didn't turn his back to her. Instead, he stepped backward slowly, honoring her presence as though she were a part of the tradition itself. When he reached the rope again, he lowered himself until he was able to slip under it. Then he stood tall, glanced at her once more, and walked back toward his jet. The crowd remained silent until he was halfway across the field. Then, one person began clapping. Another joined in, and another. Soon, the entire field erupted into applause, not for the performance, not for the jets, but for the moment they had just witnessed. But the applause wasn't for the pilot. It was for her people, who had mocked her earlier. People who had ignored her, people who had questioned her presence, they all clapped now with sincerity and humility. They didn't know her full story, but they understood enough to feel the weight of it. The old woman didn't look at the crowd. She didn't need their attention. She kept her eyes on the pilot walking back, then lifted her hand gently, not waving, but acknowledging, honoring, and letting go. When the applause faded, she took a slow breath and whispered into the warm afternoon air, I made it back. And so did you. She pressed the silver pin to her heart, closed her eyes for a brief moment, and let the memory settle peacefully inside her. Then she turned and walked away with steady steps, carrying her husband's legacy and the sky's quiet reply within her.